row certainly was a wake-up call for many of us, and you've heard a lot of experts say we're due for the big one. Joining us this morning, Steve Smith, who is an outdoor risk consultant. He's talking to us about how to stay safe if you're in the mountains, hiking, camping, or backpacking when an earthquake hits. Steve, thanks so much for joining us here again this morning. So let's talk about this. What things do we need to be aware of if a natural disaster hits, like an earthquake?
Well, thanks for having me back. And I'd like to say that I'm not just speaking theoretically. I've actually been camping outdoors with a group of kids down in Southern California when we were hit with a nearby earthquake. It was 2 or 3 in the morning, and we were shook right off of our sleeping pads in Joshua Tree National Park. Fortunately, the kids were scheduled to leave that morning anyway, so basically we just stayed awake through the rest of the night. And they got on the bus and went home. But it was a really interesting experience to be camping with students, you know, and to have that experience. And we could hear the rocks tumbling down off the rock formations nearby, and it was an eye-opening experience.
And since you've gone through something like that, what were some of those things that you have to keep in mind in that moment?
Great, yeah. So the first thing I'd like to say is that if you're outside camping or if you're in a remote place and an earthquake occurs, counterintuitively, you may actually be better off staying right where you are because an earthquake can knock out things like cell service or stoplights or electricity. And if you're in the backcountry and you've got food and fuel and a tent and all the things, you might be better off, ironically, staying right where you are and letting the issues from the earthquake resolve themselves rather than charging back into the front country where that could be more complex. Gotcha. So that's the first point I'd like to make. And the second thing I think just to really be aware of is, and we experienced this in California when that earthquake occurred, is that earthquakes knock things down, and rocks and tree limbs or dead trees that are kind of hanging out waiting to fall. We call them widowmakers in the outdoor industry. Widowmakers can be knocked over by an earthquake. So in general, it's generally a bad idea to be camping or hiking below things like that anyway, but especially when the earth is shaking and you might have things like that coming down, snow, ice, tree limbs, rocks, things like that. So just to be aware of what's above you in an earthquake, I think is a good outdoor safety tip.
And so since we talk a lot about being indoors when an earthquake strikes, get under a table, go through a door jam, all those different things, how do you kind of seek shelter outside? And sometimes you might not feel it, like you said, as bad as it is inside. So what are some of those things that you can do there?
Yeah, I think when you're outdoors, you would sort of do the opposite, which is to get away from, instead of going underneath things, you want to get out in the open. If there's a meadow, you can get away from trees or rocks or overhead things that could fall on you. And then the second one that people might not think about is, and we felt this down in California when that earthquake occurred, is the aftershocks that can occur for quite a while after the initial earthquake. And so don't be caught off guard or don't be surprised by the aftershocks. And then another big one for coastal areas is the tsunami and the possibility that an earthquake could trigger that. And if you are in a coastal area when an earthquake occurs, you should definitely be aware of the possibility of a tsunami and follow local advisories, follow tsunami evacuation routes, which in a lot of the Pacific Northwest are really clearly signed and marked. And I think we just walk right past those signs and maybe don't pay attention to them or take note of that. But it's a good thing to be aware of where is the high ground, where is a safe place to be if a tsunami occurs. Unfortunately, we haven't had anything like that here recently, but certainly a possibility. So those are some of the things that we might not think about after the earthquake.
Absolutely. Steve, thanks so much for those tips, some helpful things out there if you're camping or hiking, if an earthquake hits the next time. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon. I'm sure we'll have you back on here for another segment here. But let's send things over to Aaron for a look at that weather on this Sunday.
Yeah, not